Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, as promised, today we're going to dive into a pretty sensitive topic. And just as I even begin to talk about this, I want to say a few things up front. But first of all, the reason I'm covering this topic is I'm making my very first trip to Ireland in just a few weeks. And I'll have more to say about that as we get a little closer, and we're going to try to schedule some kind of a meetup, most likely in Dublin while I'm there. I'm going to be both in the Republic of Ireland, but also spend a day or two up in Belfast in Northern Ireland, which is a part of the United Kingdom. And while I'm in Belfast, I do plan to take some time to do some content related to the Troubles. And that's the topic we're going to talk about today. And I want to just say up front that I recognize that this is a very recent event for whom many of you who are watching have some personal connection. I've had a number of you, just in me mentioning the other day, that I was going to be covering this topic. I've had a number of comments from people who served in the British Army during the Troubles and were very concerned about me even taking on this topic. I've also heard from some of you who are in Ireland who have equal concerns. And I get it. I get it that anytime we touch on anything that's recent, it can touch a nerve for people and be a very sensitive subject, but especially when we're dealing with a topic like this, that I'll acknowledge up front I don't even begin to fully understand. And that's one of the reasons why we're going to cover this video today, is because I want to understand it better. And I think the audience should understand it better. I think for the most part, when people hear about the Troubles, they don't even really know when that time period was. Maybe you've heard of things like the U2 song Sunday Bloody Sunday, which has to do with an event that took place in 1972, which involved a similar situation for an American audience would be what we call the Boston Massacre, which involved 5 people being killed by British soldiers. In this case, Bloody Sunday involved a lot more, many of whom were teenagers. People like the song by Bryan Adams, Summer of 69. Well, they don't realize that for people in Ireland, the Summer of 69 was when this all began. So it's a very different thing for them. And this happened, my understanding is, for about a 30-year period. One of the most significant events that people are aware of because of the TV show The Crown is the bombing that took place in 1979 that killed Lord Mountbatten, who was one of the senior British commanders during the Second World War and happened to be an uncle. Great uncle to the current king, Charles III. He was an uncle to Prince Philip. And with all of that said, my goal in this video is not to try and take sides, to argue one side was right or wrong. There's plenty of wrong and plenty of right, I think, probably on both sides of this. This is just to understand it and to learn more about it. And that's going to be my goal when I go to Belfast and do a video on this topic, is not to portray right or wrong, but to say this is what happened and this is how it's viewed today by people on either side of what was this conflict that lasted for 30 years and only ended when I was in my 20s already. So I'll put a link in the description. This video is called Why the Troubles Started in Northern Ireland. It's actually by the Imperial War Museums, which made me a little concerned that maybe it was going to be coming at this from a very pro-British government stance. But I haven't watched it yet, but I read through the comments. And I saw a number of people who were on the opposite side, who were Irish Republicans, who, for a free and independent Ireland, who said, I actually thought this video handled it in a very balanced way. So I'm optimistic about that. With that said, I want to ask you, as always, to keep the comments civil. This is not a place to debate who's right or wrong. This is not a place to argue about Israel and Palestine or anything else. This is a place for us to learn and understand. Let's dive in.
This is the Falls Road in Belfast, and this is the Shankill Road. These two areas are just a few streets away from each other, and yet there is a border running between them. This vast wall stands on the first peace line in Northern Ireland. First built nearly 50 years ago as a temporary barrier to divide two communities, there is still a wall standing here today.
Isn't it interesting, because we think so much about the Berlin Wall and how much that symbolized the division between East and West, the division between capitalism and communism. And yet here in a Western democracy, in a city that's part of the United Kingdom, you have a wall that continues to exist, that my understanding is still closed at night, the gates between these two. areas.
A physical symbol of the deep divisions within Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland was formed in 1921. When Ireland seceded from the UK, 6 of Ireland's 32 counties remained as part of the United Kingdom. The governance of these counties has been contested ever since, sparking the bloody 30-year conflict known as the Troubles. In this 4-part series, we'll be taking a look at the history of the Troubles and why the scars of this conflict remain. But first of all,
Didn't realize it was a series. It's a 4-part series. So we'll see how it goes. We'll probably take a look at the other ones down the road.
let's take a look back to see what marked out the 6 counties of Northern Ireland in the first place. Religious tension in the north of Ireland dates back hundreds of years, and some of this can be traced to the plantation of Ulster. At the end of the 16th century, an Irish alliance rose up to fight against English rule.
And this is not something that just all of a sudden started in the 16th century. You go back all the way to even the times of the Scottish Wars of Independence, and as Scotland was fighting for its independence, Robert the Bruce was also sending troops into Ireland, and you have English kings throughout the centuries in the medieval period trying to conquer Ireland. You had at one point during the Wars of the Roses, you had the Duke of York sent to be in charge of the English holdings in Ireland. So Ireland has always been on the radar screen of English and then later British kings. And even, I think, Thomas Cromwell, when he was Lord Protector and wasn't even a monarch, he was a monarch in all but name. He also spent time conquering Ireland.
And a lot of the unrest took place in the province of Ulster.
Yeah.
At the end of the 9 Years' War in 1603, James VI and I, King of Scotland and England, set out to colonise and subdue the north of Ireland.
And it's interesting, she points out there, King of Scotland and England, and you'll often see it listed this way. If you're not familiar with the British monarchy, James VI comes to the throne as King of Scots, not King of Scotland. They call him King of Scots. He's king of the people, not the land. As a member of the Stuart dynasty, his great-grandmother was the sister of Henry VIII. And so when Queen Elizabeth I dies in 1603, James is the heir to the throne of England, even though he's already King of Scotland. And so he's king of both, but it's not one kingdom. He's separately both the King of Scotland as James VI and the King of England as James I. And it's only another 100 years later that his descendant, Queen Anne, is going to be the one under whom they unite the two as one government.
He sought to undertake an official plantation of Ulster to ensure its loyalty and to stop uprisings happening ever again. In this he planted mainly lowland Scots and some from the north of England into...
So if you are an American, you may very well have heard at some point that you have Scots-Irish ancestry. And to a lot of people outside the United States, that might sound like a really weird thing. How can you be Scots-Irish? They're either Scottish or Irish. Well, if you have Scots-Irish ancestry, what happened is your ancestors came from Ulster. And a lot of, especially parts of Pennsylvania, but especially North and South Carolina and parts of Virginia, were heavily settled by Scots-Irish. So as my ancestors come from Eastern Kentucky was settled by those Scots-Irish people from Virginia, North Carolina, in that area. I have a lot of Scots-Irish ancestry from Pennsylvania, too. So these are people who were originally Scottish, who then spent a couple of generations in Ulster, and then from there came to the United States. And so they came from Ireland, but they were really of Scottish heritage. And this was really an attempt by the government to change the heritage of Ireland to make it more English or British. I guess British would be the proper thing because we're talking about Scots and English. And this is laying the groundwork for what's going to happen later on. So even though you might have ancestors from Ireland, they might not actually be Irish, they might be Scottish.
6 of the 9 counties of Ulster. Earlier in 1603 there had been private plantation by Presbyterian Scots in the counties of Down and in Antrim. Scotland
undergoes this heavy kind of religious conflict of its own between different kinds of Protestants. and also Catholics that are there. And so you go to places like Edinburgh and you'll see a lot of monuments to the Covenanters who were heavily persecuted. And a lot of them came to America to avoid that persecution. It's interesting then that this was mainly Scottish lowlanders, I believe, that were settling Ulster. The Highlanders were much more independent and not really going along with the British government or the English government at that time. And it's interesting then that a century or two later, you're going to have something similar happen in the Highlands of Scotland, where you have what's called the Highland clearances, where a lot of the clans are going to be broken up. You're going to have the Jacobite rebellions going on, and you're going to have a similar thing happen where they're moving Highlanders off their plantations, off their land, and replacing them with sheep because it's a lot more valuable. So it's again kind of transforming the heritage of the land.
The actual official policy starts in 1609, and it's really there to secure this part of the country in a way that will make it not be able to rise in rebellion again.
Yep.
Over the next century, Europe was engulfed in religious wars. James II, the Catholic King of England, Scotland and Ireland, was overthrown by Protestant William of Orange in 1688. A few years later, James's supporters, the Jacobites, attempted to restore James to the throne. Supported by French forces.
And why are they called Jacobites? Because Jacob is a form of the name James.
The Irish Jacobites fought the Williamites in Ireland. The fighting culminated in two major battles, the Battle of the Boyne and the Battle of Aughrim.
And I'm hoping, if everything works out, I'm going to be visiting the Boyne battlefield while I'm there.
The Battle of the Boyne in 1690, although not a decisive battle, is very significant. A year later, in 1691, at the Battle of Aughrim, the Jacobite forces of James are actually destroyed and he is defeated. Aughrim itself, although less well known, is by far the more strategically important of the two battles, but the Boyne has a much larger geopolitical effect. And even today still, William Orange is a figure we see, particularly during the Loyalist marching season, which culminates on the 12th of July.
And yeah, to this day, when you're talking about colors, right, the orange represents those unionists, those pro-British government loyalties, whereas green represents the Republic of Ireland.
Religious conflict, as with much of Europe, was causing great divisions within Northern Ireland. But another struggle was also continuing to grow, the fight for independence from British rule. In 1845, a potato famine broke out across Ireland. The famine reinforced to a lot of Irish that although they were now part of the UK, they were not considered equal.
At that time, it's the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, because Great Britain and Ireland are two different islands. Great Britain is Wales, England, Scotland. Ireland is Ireland, and it's all one kingdom.
Irish people starved. The British continued to export food for profit. Over 1 million people died. The famine sparked rebellion and new calls for independence. Over the 19th century, there were
And if you look at the demographics to this day, Ireland has just now reached the population that it had in the 1840s before the famine. Just now, almost 200 years later. Whereas the British, or like England, for example, the population I think is 10 times, or 5 times. 5 times what it was 200 years ago. Ireland is just now back to what it was.
Multiple bills proposed for Home Rule. The first was proposed and failed in 1886. The third attempt passed in 1914, but it was put on hold due to the First World War. Irish Republicans decided to take action. They staged a rebellion over Easter week in 1916.
And we've done Extra Histories series on the Easter Rising in 1916. There have been movies made about that time. And that, it's one of those opportunities that while the British government's got its hands very, very full with what's going on the continent in the First World War, this is seen as an opportunity for Irish Republicans to fight for their independence.
The Easter Rising is planned as far back as 1914 by Patrick Pearse of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. There are a number of other groups involved, one of which will go on to become the IRA in 1919. For a week, there is a great deal of violence and there are a high level of casualties that is eventually put down by the British Army. Now, whether or not this would have gone away afterwards changed dramatically in the way that the British sought to deal with the leaders of the uprising. Many of them were actually executed by firing squad, and this and things such as the conscription policy that the British tried to introduce in Ireland, again hardened republicanism. And eventually Sinn Féin, a party who was formed back in 1905, which was been a nationalist party not linked with armed or violent republicanism, becomes a Republican Party.
And you have, of course, like in any of these scenarios, when you have a rebellion happening, you're going to have within the people who want independence arguments over how best to go about it. You're going to have people who argue for violence. There are going to be people who argue for a peaceful solution, and you're going to have everything in between. But you're going to be united in your desire for independence. Okay, how we achieve that independence we can argue about. Once we get there, then it's a new argument about how we go forward once we've achieved that independence.
It wins the 1918 general election and instantly declares an independent Ireland.
But support for the Union remained strong in the north, leading to the Irish War for Independence.
So did you notice that sign? There's always a propaganda element to this. Sinn Féin helped Germany. Irish loyalists fought for Britain. Which will you stand with? And over there on the other side, Englishmen, will you abandon Irish loyalists to men who fought for Germany? So, all of this is about propaganda, arguing, taking sides. How do you convince people?
But support for the Union remained strong in the north, leading to the Irish War for Independence, largely fought between the IRA and the British government. In 1920, Home Rule was finally granted, and Ireland was partitioned. It was meant to be a temporary solution to end the war.
There's a key right there, right? It was meant to be a temporary solution. This idea of dividing Ireland and making the parts that were in that Ulster plantation stay part of the UK, this was a compromise. This was all right, this will at least get things to calm down. But then once the problems went away and the war went away, everybody was like, it's working, let's keep it like this. Well, not everybody was okay with that. And you can see how it's all connected, right? We started a story in the 1600s to talk about something that happened in the late 1900s.
But the government in the south never formed, and the war continued until a ceasefire in 1921 and the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which granted Ireland a limited independence. The south became a free state, but still had to take an oath to the king. This agreement was not entirely popular, leading to a bloody civil war between those who were pro-treaty and those against.
So now you have a civil war between factions who were once on the same side but now disagree about the solution.
1923, the pro-treaty Free State forces prevailed, cementing the Anglo-Irish Treaty and the two-state solution, with the region in the north remaining part of Britain. The border had been drawn around 6 counties in Ulster. In some places, the border was drawn directly through the middle of towns and villages. Ulster contained 9 counties. The 3 that had been excluded were Donegal, Monaghan and Cavan. This was devised by Unionists so as to ensure a Protestant majority in the new state. But although the 6 regions had a Protestant majority...
It's gerrymandering is what it is. And they say Protestant majority, why? Because this is not only about pro-Union, pro-Britain, and pro-Republic. It's also Protestant versus Catholic.
Politically, there was a substantial Catholic population across the region. Voting was manipulated to advantage the Unionists.
So imagine for a second that you are a pro-Republic, Catholic, Irish person who is now in Northern Ireland. And you might not have the money or the means or even the desire to leave your home and go to live in the Republic. You now find yourself in the middle of the opposite side that you thought you were fighting for. If you're an American, imagine, for example, that you're in Eastern Tennessee, where Eastern Tennessee was very pro-Union at a time when Tennessee secedes from the Union. Imagine the South wins the Civil War, and now you're in Eastern Tennessee, and you're a pro-Union, pro-United States person who is against slavery, and suddenly you find yourself in a Confederate Tennessee that's independent. How would you feel, and what would you do about it? That's only a tiny bit of what this was like, because you had the religious element as well.
In many senses, the only people you could vote for sometimes were Unionists, or there would often be no point in actually putting up a candidate from a nationalist party because it wouldn't be enough of a vote for them to actually carry any win through. There were actually other things such as gerrymandering was used as well, most starkly in the city of
Isn't it interesting to hear people over there using a term that is based on a vice president of the United States who gave the name, he was Elbridge Gerry, not Jerry, but we call it gerrymandering.
Londonderry, which was an overwhelmingly nationalist community, but continued to return unionist politicians the way the boundaries were drawn up. Not only was gerrymandering an issue, also if you were not the ratepayer or the rent payer on a house, even if you were of voting age, you couldn't vote in local elections, which further discriminated against working people. Access to jobs was another area where the nationalist community we often seem to be prejudiced against, such as the big shipbuilding works in Belfast that would have an overwhelmingly Protestant workforce. But this is actually a hotly contested issue in the sense that if you didn't have a relative working in one of these factories, no matter if you were Protestant, you would often be prejudiced against as well. And on top of that, women found it very hard to get roles in some of these jobs as well.
It was in this environment, with Catholic residents consistently seen to be disadvantaged, that the civil rights movement grew among the nationalist communities.
Again, as an American, we have our own civil rights movement. It was, African Americans, particularly in the South. So it's interesting to see that, this very similar kind of thing that I think everybody can identify with, the fight for just wanting to be treated equally, that was going on in Ireland.
There was no promotion. If you were a Catholic, you just didn't get promotion. The Imperial Civil Service, if you worked in England, in London, you would get promotion. But if you were in the Northern Ireland Civil Service, there were people who weren't as experienced as you who were promoted over you. Housing was another thing. That was the start of the civil rights movement. There was a young single girl got a house where a Catholic family didn't get it,
So imagine, it's always important to try and understand this stuff. It's not like out of nowhere people just started blowing stuff up and fighting. There seems to be an escalation of this. We're trying the peaceful solution, and then when the peaceful solution's not working, some people thought, well, we need to be more extreme with this because it's not working. So, just trying to get yourself in the mindset of how something like this could come about.
I never mixed, never had any Protestant friends until I started nursing, really. But it's still there, the hatred, deep hatred. It's dreadful.
Communities and attitudes became deeply polarised through near 30 years of conflict in Northern Ireland. Many of the events that took place during this time are hotly contested. Moreover, they are highly disputed as well. Often starkly and highly diverse versions of events exist on both sides.
In the United States, I'm just drawing these parallels because I know this is a primarily American audience here. I referred to the Boston Massacre at the beginning. Boston Massacre was spun to the American people as the tyrannical British occupiers of Boston firing on unarmed civilians. Well, if you look a little deeper, it was not quite so black and white as that. It was a mob that, rightly or wrongly, was angry about the occupation by British forces, was upset about taxes, that was egging on and threatening British soldiers. Somehow a shot gets fired, and the next thing you know, 5 people are dead. It's complicated. It's gray. It's not black and white. And John Adams, who's a strong patriot, who is going to be a signer of the Declaration of Independence. In fact, he made the motion. Well, I shouldn't say he made the motion. He is the one who, he made the motion to make George Washington commander of the army, and he's one of the driving forces behind independence. He defended these British soldiers in the Boston Massacre trial. So all of this stuff is so layered and complicated, and depending on which side you're on, you're going to see it very, very differently.
And many people will never come to a point of agreement on what happened on certain days at certain times.
Throughout the late 60s, tension was rising. In 1969, at the annual Apprentice Boys of Derry March, violence erupted. The route of the march passed through the predominantly Catholic Bogside area of Derry, Londonderry, resulting in violent clashes between the marchers and the residents.
Several days of rioting ensued. The police became involved. Weapons were fired, battering round guns were used, stones were thrown, and bits of the Bogside were shut off to the police. When the police moved into the Bogside, loyalist groups moved in behind them. This was probably not the police's intention, but it galvanised opinion within the nationalist Republican community. In the same sense, violence broke out in other parts of Northern Ireland as well, and people were burned out of homes in both Loyalist and Republican communities. And the troubles at this point really begins in Northern Ireland.
In 1969, the IRA split and a breakaway group who called themselves the Provisional IRA formed.
IRA is Irish Republican Army.
Divisions in the IRA had been growing through the 1960s. In 1962, the new IRA Chief of Staff, Cathal Golding, sought to move the IRA in a different direction. He was keen that the movement became political in its outlook rather than one that relied on armed struggle.
So there again, you have even within people who agree on the political solution that they want to see the outcome, they disagree on how to get there.
Which to traditional Republicans was seen as a betrayal of their cause. They saw their task as the defence of nationalist communities and the expulsion of the British from Ireland. Loyalist paramilitaries such as the Red Hand Commando, the Ulster Defence Association and the Ulster Volunteer Force also grew in numbers. Ian Paisley was a Presbyterian minister.
You have 5 different groups here. They all want, in the end, the same thing, but they're all going to disagree vehemently on how to get there. And can you unite them behind a common cause and behind a common purpose and how to get there? Or are they going to fight amongst themselves?
Minister who established himself as an outspoken leader within unionism, leading marches throughout the 60s and 70s. As the rival groups grew, tensions rose. Over these decades, violent attacks and bombings increased in frequency, and barricades went up to separate the two communities. The Provisional IRA escalated their armed campaign against the British and Northern Irish security forces. Many nationalists saw the Provisional IRA as defenders of their community, and loyalists saw them as dangerous insurgents.
And imagine being caught up in the middle of all this. Your people just trying to live your lives. You might have opinions on this one way or another, but you're just trying to live your life. Or you're a British soldier who signed up to fight for your country and didn't know that that would mean that you would be sent to Northern Ireland to fire on other British subjects. So it's ugly and it's complicated, and a lot of people who didn't want to be involved in the fight end up right in the middle of it.
In reaction to this violence, the British Army were deployed on the streets in Operation Banner. They were called in to support the RUC and protect infrastructure and civilians, but ultimately their presence served to escalate the situation.
And now you're a target.
To IWM's conservation studio to have a look at this weapon here, which is a baton round gun, which was used by the British Army and the Royal Ulster Constabulary in riot control situations. This type of weapon could fire a variety of ammunition from CS gas canisters, but more usually rubber bullets and more latterly plastic bullets. The British Army was deployed in Northern Ireland in 1969 at the behest of the then Prime Minister, and it changed the relationship with Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom, where now the British government itself took a more active role because the army were very much within their control.
And what happens when you have that step of violence happening, and now this is what happened in Boston in the 1770s, is you have unrest happening, rebellion against, in that case, taxes. The British government sends in the troops to crack down on it and restore peace and order, and all that does is escalate. And now the other side's going to escalate, and both sides are going to keep escalating until it just spirals out of control.
Initially, in some areas, they were seen as being protective and helpful of the nationalist Catholic community, but as the situation developed in Northern Ireland and the army's role became more intense, they were no longer seen as a neutral actor. Although seen as an effective form of crowd control, if used incorrectly, the bullets could in themselves be fatal. Yeah. There were a number of fatalities caused by rubber and more latterly the plastic bullets, which were at the time thought to be less lethal, but turned out to be no less so. This was often seen as a fairly heavy-handed approach, and nationalist communities often saw that they were the ones more targeted by British soldiers with these particular weapons than those in loyalist communities.
In 1970, the Ulster Defence Regiment was formed, becoming the largest regiment in the British Army.
They consisted of people who came from Northern Ireland. They didn't go home, they didn't have tours of duty, they came from the community from which they defended. Although there was a drive to include Catholics in the recruitment, and some did join, it largely was unsuccessful because of pressure in nationalist and Republican communities, and also because the force was seen, as with the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the police force, to be overwhelmingly Protestant, and was viewed from a nationalist Republican standpoint as being a tool of the oppressor, if you will. The UDR did draw controversy. There were accusations from Republicans of collusion with loyalist paramilitaries, some of which may have been true, others may have been overstated. Even within the loyalist community, many of them didn't see them as friends either, whereas others saw them as neutral. So their position was difficult, and it was dangerous, and it certainly was controversial at times.
And I think that was the hardest thing any of us had to deal with, the fact that this was a United Kingdom city, and yet you were there.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying a few minutes ago. Imagine yourself as a member of the British Army, and you're sent to deal with this. This is your own country where you're being sent to fight.
You're in the middle of a war zone, and it was a war zone. It was a war zone, and there was a lot of violence and a lot of anger. You had all that debris from the first riots, all the burnt-out streets and things.
And what were the people like?
The ones that were friendly were very friendly, but the ones that weren't, they are exact opposite. You got stoned and bottled and petrol bombed and all the rest of it in the Protestant area just as much as you did in the Catholic one. You really were piggy in the middle.
The British Army arriving in Northern Ireland faced a difficult challenge. In their efforts to defeat the IRA, hostility from the Catholic community grew towards the British Army, and this was severely aggravated by the introduction of the Fool's Curfew in July.
So yeah, you have a situation now where some people who maybe didn't agree with the IRA and agree with the violence that was happening by some of these paramilitary groups are now pushed off the fence because of the presence of the British Army. And this escalation divides people more and more. A lot of people were in the middle and maybe were like, well, you know, I like this, but I don't like this. Now they're taking sides because they feel like they're being forced to take sides by what they see as an aggression by one side or the other.
July 1970. What started off as a search for weapons in a Catholic nationalist area resulted in clashes between local residents throwing petrol bombs and the British soldiers firing CS gas. In response to this clash, the entire area was sealed off and a curfew was imposed. Large amounts of weapons were seized by the British troops, but in the process of the operation, 4 civilians were killed and dozens others injured. The same month in the House of Commons, the UK Home Secretary declared, "We are now at war with the IRA." The following year, the policy of internment sparked further anger. Operation Demetrius involved the imprisonment without trial of suspected IRA members. The British Army conducted sweeps and arrested more than 340 people from Catholic and nationalist backgrounds. But due to faulty intelligence, many of these people in fact had no connection to armed republicanism. The treatment of some of those arrests...
So again, you're escalating this. You think you're helping bring peace to the situation, but you're actually angering people, and innocent people are getting caught up in this. And you're once again just dividing those lines. And now you're taking a British government that maybe was seen by a lot of people as, you know what, we don't really want to be part of Britain, but they're not the enemy. Well, now they're the enemy.
...was later categorised as torture.
We're standing in front of a cabinet here in the galleries, and in here we have a poster which is a protest against the Northern Irish government's policy of internment in 1971. These initial sweeps caused 4 days of rioting in which over 20 people died. Posters like these would have appeared on walls, on lampposts, etc. in Northern Ireland at the time as a protest against what was felt to be an unjust policy targeted against the nationalist community. Indeed, Loyalists would not be subject to the same internment without trial until 1973.
The backlash to internment was strong. It sparked a lot of violence, a recruitment boost for the IRA, and a deepening of divisions between Loyalists and Nationalists.
1972 was the worst year of violence in Northern Ireland, but from the couple of years before that, the violence had been escalating. Northern Ireland was starting to appear on the news regularly at nights, and civilians bore the brunt of it as far as casualties were concerned.
There seemed at this point to be no resolution in sight, but the worst was still to come.
Bloody Sunday.
The presence of the British Army and the growth of the paramilitaries all ramped up the violence of the Troubles. The IRA had already split, but their strategy was about to entirely change. As the violence increased and spread beyond Northern Irish borders, the road to peace would not be easy.
Okay, well, we are just getting into this story, so obviously it feels like we should probably continue. But we'll see how this goes today. We'll see how the comment section is. We'll see how the views are. We'll see if this is a topic you guys want to continue to dive in. Like I said, let's keep it civil. Let's talk about what we can learn from all of this, not argue about who was right and wrong and start laying blame. That doesn't really help anybody. So let me know what you think in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.